Okay, so are you ready to separate the visionaries from the con artists?
Always up for a challenge.
Good, because today we're diving deep into the world of Elizabeth Holmes and her company, Theranos.
Ah, yes, Elizabeth Holmes, the Silicon Valley it girl, who promised to revolutionize blood testing.
Exactly. She claimed she could diagnose hundreds of conditions with just a tiny drop of blood.
And for a while, everyone believed her.
She was on magazine covers, giving TED Talks, attracting billions in investments.
Yeah, she built this incredible aura around herself and her company.
But then it all came crashing down.
The Wall Street Journal investigation exposed the truth.
The technology didn't work, the tests were unreliable, and patients were being misled.
It was a massive scandal that shook Silicon Valley to its core.
And it left everyone wondering, was she a true believer who got in over her head, or a straight-up con artist?
Right? Was she a grifter or gifted?
Well, to answer that question, we've got a mountain of material to dig through.
Articles, court documents, podcast transcripts, you name it.
We're going to try to piece together the whole story from her early days at Stanford to the dramatic collapse of Theranos.
And hopefully, by the end of this deep dive, we'll have a better understanding of what really went on.
So let's start at the beginning.
All right. Back in 2003, Elizabeth Holmes was just 19 years old when she dropped out of Stanford to start Theranos.
19 years old. That's younger than most college sophomores.
I know, right? But she had this grand vision to revolutionize healthcare.
She wanted to make blood testing painless and accessible to everyone.
And her idea was pretty revolutionary at the time.
She envisioned a device that could run hundreds of tests on just a single drop of blood.
And it would all be done with a simple finger prick, no more big needles or vials of blood.
It sounded amazing.
It did. And she called this revolutionary device the Edison.
The Edison, like Thomas Edison, the inventor.
Exactly. She was trying to position herself as this game-changing innovator just like him.
And for a while, it seemed like she was on the right track.
She managed to raise millions of dollars in funding from some very high-profile investors.
People like Larry Ellison, Tim Draper, and even the Walton family.
Yeah, she had this incredible ability to sell her vision and get people to buy into it.
She was charismatic, she was articulate, and she had this Steve Jobs-esque aura about her.
The black turtlenecks, the intense stare, the whole package.
It's amazing how much image can influence perception.
It really is. And in Silicon Valley, image is everything.
So how did she manage to build Theranos into a multi-billion-dollar company if the technology didn't actually work?
That's the big question, isn't it?
I mean, was she deliberately deceiving investors, or did she truly believe that the Edison would eventually work?
It's hard to say for sure, but there's evidence to suggest that she was at least willing to bend the truth to get what she wanted.
Like what?
Well, for example, she often claimed that Theranos technology was being used by the U.S. military in the field.
Really?
Yeah, but there's no evidence to support that claim.
So she was basically lying to investors and the public.
It seems that way, and this wasn't just a one-time thing.
There were other instances.
Oh, yeah. There were numerous examples of her exaggerating or outright fabricating information about the company's capabilities.
That's pretty damning.
It is, and it raises serious questions about her integrity and her motives.
So if the technology wasn't working, how are they actually conducting these blood tests?
Well, according to the Wall Street Journal investigation, they were using traditional blood testing methods for most of their tests.
The same methods that they claim to be disrupting.
Exactly. They were basically running a conventional lab, but hiding it behind this facade of revolutionary technology.
And patients were being given results from these unreliable tests.
Yeah, which is incredibly concerning.
This is starting to sound like a full-blown con job.
It's certainly looking that way. But we'll dive deeper into the evidence in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos.
So before the break, we were talking about how Theranos was using traditional blood testing methods despite their claims of revolutionary technology.
And how they misled investors and the public about their capabilities.
Right, and it's important to remember that this wasn't just some small-scale deception.
This was a company valued at billions of dollars.
With powerful people on their board.
Like former Secretaries of State George Shultz and Henry Kissinger.
Exactly. These were not naive people. They were experienced and influential figures.
So how do they get sucked into this?
Well, that's part of what makes this story so fascinating.
Well, Holmes was a master manipulator.
She was incredibly skilled at creating this aura of credibility and legitimacy around herself and her company.
And she was very good at silencing anyone who dared to question her.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
She used intimidation tactics and legal threats to shut down any criticism.
Like the Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou who broke the story,
Right. She tried to discredit him and prevent him from publishing his investigation.
which of course only made her look more guilty.
Exactly. It's a classic case of trying to cover up a lie and making things worse.
So what happened when the truth finally came out?
Well, it all unraveled pretty quickly.
Regulators launched investigations. Investors pulled out, partnerships dissolved.
And in 2018, Theranos was forced to shut down.
Just like that.
Pretty much it was a spectacular fall from grace.
And then came the criminal charges.
Right. Both Holmes and her former partner and COO, Sunny Balwani, were indicted on multiple counts of fraud.
Wait, Sunny Balwani? Who's that?
He was a key player in the Theranos saga, even though he wasn't as visible as Holmes.
What was his role?
He was the president and COO of the company, and he was also romantically involved with Holmes.
Really?
Yeah.
That adds a whole other layer of complexity to this story.
It does. Their relationship was kept secret from investors and the public for years.
Why would they do that?
Well, some speculate that it was to protect the image of Holmes as this young female visionary.
Because having an older male partner might have undermined that narrative.
Exactly, and Balwani was known to be a tough and demanding figure.
Some former employees have described him as volatile and abusive.
Right. He was definitely the enforcer at Theranos.
So was he the mastermind behind the fraud?
That's hard to say for sure, but he was deeply involved in the company's operations, and he was aware of the deception.
So he shares the blame with Holmes.
Absolutely. They were both found guilty on multiple counts of fraud.
And sentenced to prison.
Right. Holmes received a sentence of over 11 years.
And Balwani?
He got almost 13 years.
Wow. So the justice system ultimately held them accountable for their actions.
It did, but the Theranos saga raises a lot of questions about the culture of Silicon Valley.
Like what?
Well, the pressure to succeed, the obsession with growth, the willingness to bend the rules to get ahead.
It seems like ethics took a backseat to ambition in this case.
That's one way to put it, and the consequences were devastating.
Not just for Holmes and Balwani, but for investors' patience and the entire biotech industry.
Right. The Theranos scandal really eroded trust in the field.
And it made people question whether the hype around Silicon Valley innovation was justified.
Exactly. It was a wake-up call for the entire tech world.
So what can we learn from this?
Well, for one thing, we need to be more critical of the stories we're told, especially when it comes to groundbreaking technologies.
We shouldn't just blindly accept the hype.
Right. We need to ask tough questions, demand evidence, and hold people accountable.
Because, as we've seen with Theranos, the line between vision and deception can be incredibly thin.
And the consequences of crossing that line can be severe.
So what about the role of the media in all of this?
That's another important question. The media played a significant role in building up the myth of Elizabeth Holmes.
They were seduced by her story, just like everyone else.
Exactly. And they often portrayed her as this brilliant icon, a symbol of female empowerment.
But they failed to scrutinize her claims or investigate the underlying technology.
Right. They were more interested in the narrative than the facts.
So the media shares some of the blame for what happened.
I think that's a fair assessment. They could have done a better job of holding Holmes and Theranos accountable.
And maybe prevented some of the damage.
Possibly. But it's important to remember that journalists are also susceptible to deception.
Especially when it's coming from a charismatic and well-connected source like Holmes.
Exactly. She was very good at manipulating the media to her advantage.
So what lessons can we learn about the media's role in covering stories like this?
Well, I think it highlights the need for greater skepticism and scrutiny.
Journalists need to do their due diligence.
Exactly. They need to go beyond the surface and really dig into the facts.
And not be afraid to challenge powerful people or institutions.
Right. Even if those people are as charming and persuasive as Elizabeth Holmes.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I think the Theranos saga has prompted a much-needed conversation about ethics and accountability in Silicon Valley.
And hopefully it will lead to some positive changes.
I hope so. But it's also a reminder that we can't just rely on regulations or institutions to prevent these kinds of scandals.
We all have a responsibility to be informed and to think critically.
And to speak up when we see something that doesn't seem right.
Because ultimately it's up to us to ensure that innovation is used for good and not for deception.
Well said.
So stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore the aftermath of the Theranos scandal and the broader implications for the future of technology and innovation. Okay, so we've uncovered a lot about Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. But there's still that lingering question. Was she a visionary who lost her way, or a con artist from the very beginning?
That's the question everyone's asking, and honestly, there's no easy answer.
It's almost like she was playing two different roles, right?
Exactly. On one hand, you have this brilliant young woman who drops out of Stanford at 19 with a revolutionary idea.
Right. She wants to make healthcare accessible and affordable for everyone.
A noble goal, and she manages to convince some incredibly smart and powerful people to back her.
People like Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, not exactly dummies.
Right, so there must have been something genuine about her vision, at least initially.
But then you have all this evidence of deception, of outright lies about the technology's capabilities.
And the lengths she went to silence critics and cover up the truth.
It's hard to reconcile those two sides of the story.
It really is. It's like she was living a double life.
Maybe the pressure got to her, the weight of expectations.
Possibly, Silicon Valley is notorious for its move fast and break things mentality.
Maybe she felt like she had to keep up the facade even when things started to fall apart.
And that's where the line between vision and deception gets blurred.
It's like the old saying, fake it till you make it. But in this case, the faking went too far.
Exactly. She crossed the line from optimism to outright fraud.
And ultimately, she paid the price for it.
She did 11 years in prison. That's a hefty sentence.
It sends a clear message that corporate fraud won't be tolerated.
No matter how charismatic or convincing the perpetrator may be.
So what about Sunny Balwani, her former partner and COO?
He was sentenced to almost 13 years.
Even longer than Holmes.
It seems the court saw him as more culpable, perhaps because of his age and experience.
He should have known better.
Right, he was supposed to be the voice of reason, the steady hand guiding the company.
Instead, he enabled and even encouraged the deception.
And in the end, they both faced the consequences.
So what can we learn from all of this?
Yeah.
What's the takeaway from the Theranos saga?
Well, I think it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition.
The allure of Silicon Valley, the pursuit of the next big thing, can sometimes blind people to the ethical implications.
Exactly. We need to be more discerning, more skeptical, more willing to question the stories we're told.
Especially when those stories are too good to be true.
Right. If something sounds like a miracle, it probably is.
And we need to remember that innovation without integrity is ultimately meaningless.
It's just a house of cards waiting to collapse.
Well said.
Mm.
And that's our deep dive into the world of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, a story of ambition, deception, and the fine line between vision and delusion. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a fascinating discussion.